Dr. Andy Messmer, thank you so much for taking the time for this today.
Yeah, thank you. Real pleasure to be here.
I'm really excited for this. I have to say, I have an undergraduate degree in theology. I am almost done my master's. I feel like I've done more than my fair share of reading and studying in church history, and I know next to nothing about the Spanish Reformation. I don't think that's unique to me, though. And why is that? Why don't more people talk about this?
Well, if it makes you feel any better, you know as much about the Spanish Reformation as most Spanish speakers know about the Spanish Reformation. It's been overlooked by everyone. And there's a few reasons for that. One is in the English speaking world, there are very few works translated into English. There was a time in the 19th century, early 20th century, where a few people were translating some works into English, but they're hard to find, or it's old English, or the scans available online aren't good, and if you're not like dying to learn about it, it's too easy to not learn about it. Um, and it's overlooked in a lot of academic works. There's this. I always use this as an illustration. There's this work. I forget who the author is. Lindbergh, the European Reformations. Lindbergh, the European Reformations, and he treats country by country the Reformation there. And Spain, doesn't even appear. That's not even in a footnote. There's nothing in the index. Nothing about the Spanish Reformation. So even in a lot of standard textbooks for English speakers, you'll just never come across it. And that's not true only about Spain. That's true about the Reformation in Southern Europe. So not much is known in the English speaking world about the Reformation in Italy, for example, or about the few Protestants in Portugal, for example. So it's not just Spain. It's Southern Europe, which is kind of unknown for a lot of people. And then I guess another reason why it's not known very much is just because we don't have a lot of sources. I've never done like a scientific study on this, but I would bet a lot of money that Martin Luther himself wrote more than all the Spanish reformers combined. Like, I don't think we could fill a whole bookcase with Spanish works written by the Spanish Reform. We could fill a few bookshelves, but not a whole bookcase. So, not a lot of sources, and the few sources that there are not translated into English, and then standard works on the topic. They don't talk about it. So, you know, not a lot. Just it's hard to find out about the Spanish Reformation, I guess, is what I'm getting to.
Well, hopefully we'll be able to help people with that a little bit today, and I'll be
Okay,
helped
great.
myself as we go through this. So I guess my like assumption would have been, having never looked into this, that well, it must be the case that the reason we don't talk about the Spanish Reformation is because it was staunchly Catholic before, it stayed Catholics, and so much couldn't have really happened there. That must be the end of the story. That's why we don't talk about it in the way that we talk about Germany or Switzerland or England. I imagine there's something to that, like it remained majority Catholic, but I also imagine that we're missing a whole lot with that kind of one sentence explanation. So if you would, could you give us a sense of like the broad arc of the story of the Reformation in Spain? Obviously, it didn't become a majority Protestant nation, but I sense that doesn't mean nothing happened. So could you help me kind of at the 30,000 foot view get a sense of what went on, and then maybe we can dig into some of the characters and themes after that?
Sure. Well, let me start off by saying I'm calling you now from just outside of Seville, in the town. It's a town called Santi Ponce, where we have this famous monastery where the monks there became Protestant, and that's why our seminary is here. But our seminary, we offer, as far as we know, the only place in the world that offers a 1 year master's program in the Spanish Reformation. And we do that in Spanish, but I've also helped people doing their PhD work in English. I've offered them independent studies on the Spanish Reformation in English. So, in case anyone wants to come down from the 30,000 foot level and learn more, please reach out, and I'd love to talk to you more about this in English. But so 30,000 foot level, our Reformation started before Luther. It wasn't pure Protestantism, but we had this movement in Spanish is called the Alumbrado movement. It's like the illumined ones or the enlightened ones. It was a mixture of mysticism and actually Jewish spirituality. 1492, where the Jews had to either leave Spain or become Christian. The ones that did become Christian brought with them their spiritual practices, and it was a renovation in the church. And so there was something going on before Luther even came on the scene. I guess you could kind of think of something similar to maybe like the Waldensian movement before Luther came on. It was just kind of preparing the soil for Protestantism, if you will. And we had that in Spain. And then our first kind of breakthrough was at the newly established university in a town called Alcalá de Henares. I should probably say these words with a thicker English accent so people know what I'm talking about, but
No,
we'll
make it
call it
authentic.
Alcalá de Henares, I guess is what you say in English. But and there people they were exposed to the scriptures, and they were exposed to new thought, and that's where a lot of our reformers ended up coming from. And so in the year 1529, our first real reformer, his name was Juan de Valdez. He wrote a book that got him into trouble. He ended up having to go to Italy, which is where the Italian Reformation draws a lot of its roots from. But that was kind of the first work to try to reform the church in one way or another. Well, there was a bishop in the southern part of Spain, in Seville. He really liked what was going on there in Alcalá. And so he invited some of the best professors to come down, and that's what they did. They came down to Seville, and they started preaching Protestant doctrine. Some of them found out about Luther and his works, and about John Calvin and his works. And then there was kind of this underground movement, or underground church. I don't know if you'd call it actually a church, but an underground meetings of Christians all around Seville and the surrounding territories. And they ended up preaching the gospel. And there were probably, estimates vary how many there were here, but usually the figures are there were about 1,000 or so Christians here, which was maybe 5% of the population or so. And then some other reformers, they went up north into a town called Valladolid, where there was another large group up in northern Spain. And then there were just little pockets of Protestants throughout Spain, which, if we're keeping it at the 30,000 foot level, I'll just say there were little pockets of Protestants throughout Spain. So yeah, there was, they were kind of doing their own thing, formulating their own theology. They had the Alumbrado movement as the background. They had Erasmus was a big influence. And then they had some Reformation thought. And they took all of these things and their own spirituality and approach to the Christian life, and they made their own Reformed Catholic doctrine and practice. And then one day in 1557, this was all underground. I mean, this was all totally illegal in Spain. And in 1557, one of the book smugglers who would bring in Bibles and like works by John Calvin and others, he was caught by the Inquisition. And that's when the Spanish Inquisition realized we've got a lot of Protestants in our country. And that's when the Protestant Reformation stopped in Spain. There were what's called an auto de fe, which is where they would put people on the big wooden stands, and they would have their trials, and then they could either recant or they would be punished. Some of them would be burned alive. Some of them would be killed and then burned. Others would be given, lifelong, have to do penance for the rest of their lives, stuff like that. But right before that happened, a group of Spanish Protestants fled Spain, so they made it safely out of Spain, and they started writing about what had happened in Spain, and they started translating the Bible, and they started writing other books, and they became pastors in other churches in France and England and Germany and the Low Countries, and that's how we know really what was going on in Spain is because of what they did. So 30,000 foot view. It was a movement that was started a little bit before Luther, had its own unique kind of ingredients that went into it. The Alumbrado kind of mystic Jewish element, the Christian humanist Erasmian movement, the Protestant movement with their own kind of take on these things. And then it was strongest in Spain in the 1530s, 40s, and then the first half of the 1550s was when it was kind of it's at its peak, which was never huge because it was totally illegal and everything was underground. And then 1557 is the date where just everything came to a halt.
That's fascinating. And I want to follow up on so many different strands of this. I'll try to keep them all in my mind, but we'll kind of go through them and see where this leads us. The first that's really intriguing to me is this strain of Jewish mysticism. One thing that you learn about a little bit when you're studying like the medieval period is that it seemed like Spain, of all places, was an interesting melting pot where you have both Christianity, Jewish influences, and then at times also Muslim influences down towards the southern part of Spain. And that there were brief moments where there was real interesting interchange between cultures here. And I'm fascinated by that, generally speaking. But I'd love to know, what did this Jewish mysticism look like? And kind of what influence did that have in giving it a distinctive flair to the Spanish Reformation?
Yeah, just a real quick a nuance. When I said mysticism, I was referring especially to Franciscan mysticism, like in Cisneros and then Savonarola from Rome. But it is true that there was also, I guess you could call it a mystic element in the Jewish influence, and this goes back to late 14th, early 15th century. In fact, there was a really famous book written. I've only read the Spanish translation because it was published originally in Italian, but the Spanish title is A Spanish Heresy, and it just traces Jewish thought in the church through a chain of thinkers from I want to say the early 15th century all the way up to the Spanish reformers, like the people I mentioned, like Juan de Valdez and Constantino de la Fuente and others. So there was this kind of a continuity of thought that lasted well over a century in Spain because of this issue that you're mentioning. And there's lots of things you could say about this, but I guess kind of going to the core of what we find so interesting as Protestants is they really rejected a lot of the external ceremonies of the church in favor of an internal piety and a personal direct relationship with God. And so, one of these branches of the Alumbrado movement, there's kind of two main branches, but one of them was called the dejados, or the those who just abandon themselves to God's love. And so, they're not looking to themselves or to their works or anything in them. They're looking to Christ alone. And so, and this was, you can trace this broad way of thinking through the 15th century and then into the 16th century, which is why when Protestantism came, it was just the soil was already there. It was just a natural merging of the two. So yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Hey, I hope you guys are enjoying this video, but one thing I know people don't always enjoy is the ads that go with these videos. Now look, ads are how YouTubers like me are able to pay the bills, but if you want to watch these videos early, ad-free, and with my post-show reflections at the end, you can do so by becoming a patron at any tier by going to patreon.com/gospelsimplicity. From $7 a month to $100 a month, your support helps this channel keep going and growing. And not only will you get early ad-free access to these interviews, but you will also get access to the Gospel Simplicity Book Club, where we read the Church Fathers together, and it is an absolute blast. So if you want those perks and others, go to patreon.com/gospelsimplicity. It certainly does, and it's always really interesting to see, like you said, whether it's the Waldensians or the Hussites or the Wycliffites, how these different movements kind of paved the way. And even if people want to kind of debate, whether we should use terms like proto-Protestant or how aligned earlier movements are with later movements, at the very least, we can see that Protestantism was able to not just like come out of nowhere, but light certain or kind of add fuel to fires that were already existing and kind of channel that in really interesting ways. Yeah. So the second thing I want to look at here within that broad sketch is the Inquisition, because obviously that is something that has like broad appeal to people, right? It's the stuff of movies and books and popular imagination. And it seems that we can be in danger of doing two different things with the Inquisition. On the one hand, we can make it overly like Hollywood-esque and maybe exaggerate certain things. But I see often a pendulum swing in the other direction, especially in the people that watch my videos who maybe are considering becoming Catholic or want to understand history more. And they're saying, wait a second, maybe it wasn't, as bad as we think. Maybe there's nuance here and all of that, which we always want nuance. But help me kind of go in a little bit more of what did the Spanish Inquisition look like for Protestants? And yeah, in a way that helps us kind of find that balance between the Hollywoodization of it and the kind of sweeping it under the rug.
Yeah, this is really difficult, and I'll confess it's really difficult for me to be objective for, I guess, two reasons. One is I'm not an expert on the Inquisition per se. There are experts on the Inquisition, and I'm an expert more on the Spanish Protestantism per se. And the other reason is, and I mean this with total respect, but if you listen to a Holocaust survivor, they don't even want to listen to what the other side has to say. They lived through it, and they are the victims. And I represent Holocaust survivors from the 16th century. So I mean, it's hard reading their sources and empathizing with them to be objective. Now, I will say this: that you did point out something very, very, very true, that there is a tendency to exaggerate the Spanish Inquisition and even to forget things that were done in Protestant countries against Roman Catholics, and to think that it was totally one-sided. Now, I think that there are differences, but I mean, it's not. And when it comes to the issue of religious persecution, it's not. Protestants wore the white hats and Roman Catholics wore the black hats, and it was kind of like good guys versus bad guys. It's reality. History is much more complicated than that. But so I will say this. When it comes to the Inquisition, there were many, 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 many more Muslims. And if I'm not mistaken, I have to check on this one, but many more Muslims were processed by the Inquisition than Protestants or Jews. Protestants and Jews were made up just a fraction of the vast majority. Now, the reason why so many Muslims were prosecuted is because there was a moment in time, 1492, where Spain said, you either leave or you're Roman Catholic. And there was a kingdom, a whole kingdom in southern Spain of Muslims. And those who didn't leave technically were Christians. And so the Spanish Inquisition could process them at any time they wanted to. So way more Muslims were prosecuted than Christians, but than Protestants. But, Protestants were persecuted. And I think that as a Protestant, the real power of the Inquisition wasn't so much in the number of people who were processed. And I should know this, and I don't know the exact number, but I would estimate that the number of Protestants who were killed by the Inquisition to be somewhere in the low dozens to be killed. Now, there were others who were sentenced to lifelong, penance and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But those who were actually killed, probably in the low dozens. But the real power, I think, was psychological. I mean, if you could imagine, like in America, for example, a prominent, I don't know if you want to call him Democrat or Republican. I don't want to take sides on any of this, but imagine a prominent public figure being burned alive on national television. And then, it like, we're coming after this party. The psychological effect that I would have to silence everyone and to really squelch any kind of resistance was just, I mean, it was just incredible. So I think a lot of it was just the psychological effect that it has to see heretics, Protestants, being condemned by all the authorities, by state, by the church, by Franciscans, by Dominicans, by townspeople. I mean, the whole country was united in condemning them. Just the psychological power that has. So yeah, I mean, we could get into the details of the torture and stuff like that. I think you probably don't want to get into that, but it was for those who suffered. It was an incredibly a tragic affair, and also just very unjust for them, because they were. I mean, it's really interesting to read the Spanish Reformers, because they actually read themselves in the light of the Gospels. So in the Gospels, you have the religious leaders, Pharisees and Sadducees, who are persecuting those who are preaching the gospel. They're persecuting Jesus and his disciples. And they come to the 16th century and they say, this is exactly what's happening. Modern day Pharisees and Sadducees and Herodians, they are persecuting us for preaching the gospel. And so that they filter their experience through the Gospels, and just that's how they understood what was going on in Spain. So for them, it was very hard to to be objective or to see it from the other person's perspective or anything like that. It was very hard on them.
Absolutely. And I don't think it would be reasonable for anyone to expect someone who's in the midst of that to try to like remove themselves from it and be like, well, I'm trying to see if like obviously that suffering would be so immediate. And I think it's only with time and with, the ability of, for me as someone who like this doesn't personally affect, you're able to start kind of thinking about it this way. And I respect the fact that even for you being in that country, it's going to have kind of a different flavor to it. So I appreciate you taking on that question and navigating it rather well. I want to look at the flip side of that, if you will. And maybe that's not a fair characterization, but if we have this picture of kind of religious exclusivism and religious persecution, something that really interested me in doing this video was hearing you talk about the vision of Protestantism that the Spanish Reformers put forward that had some commonalities with Anglicanism of trying to be a via media or a middle way between Protestantism and Roman Catholicism on the other hand. And you argue that the Spanish Reformers' view of this was perhaps even broader or more generous in that way. I'm absolutely fascinated by this. So please tell me a bit about this kind of outlook of the Spanish Reformation.
So Spanish Reformation took shape in a unique context. It was largely isolated, not completely isolated, but largely isolated and insulated from a lot of the debates between, for example, Lutherans and Reformed. So they also had unique background. The Alumbrado movement, the mysticism movement, lends itself towards not being dogmatically exclusivistic. There's this way of seeing it and not that way of seeing it. Christian humanism, the Erasmian movement, Christian humanist movement, put more of an emphasis on living out the faith rather than on finally distinguishing between, this view of predestination and the other 7 views of predestination. And you have to pick my view, otherwise you're a heretic for these 12 reasons. It's like it didn't do that. And then also it developed in the context of persecution. And persecution has the amazing ability to make secondary issues very secondary and primary issues very primary. And so it was just born in a context that led to a uniting movement. In fact, this may seem crazy to other people, but we know from the Inquisition documents they would process commoners and they would list all their heresies. And people in the same geographic area, presumably attending the same, we'll call them cell groups or small groups or whatever. Some of them saying, yeah, there are 2 sacraments, and others saying, yeah, there are 3 sacraments. Some saying Christ is present in the bread, as the Lutherans say, and then others say Christ is in the bread only spiritually, which is technically not what the Lutherans are saying. And so even in the Inquisition documents that we find them apparently just fine with diversity on some of these issues. It just wasn't the most important thing. So when I look back on the Spanish reformers and what they were saying, I take a lot. Well, it's hard to say who's the most famous because, especially in the English-speaking world, no one's famous from the Spanish Reformation. But amongst the few of us who know about the Spanish Reformation, it's hard to say who's the most famous. But a good case can be made for our Bible translator. His name was Cassiodoro de Reina, and He was one who was one of these underground pastors in Seville, actively involved. He was one of the monks here in our town that became Protestant. And then he went to England and started a church. And in order to start a church, he had to write a confession of faith. And I see his confession of faith as summarizing Spanish Protestant theology from Seville, which was the epicenter of Spanish theology. And so I base a lot of what I view on Reina and on his confession of faith as kind of a uniting confession of faith of Spanish Protestantism in general. By the way, it is available online in English. I have a translation available. It's self-published on Amazon, and then there's this bilingual edition available on Amazon as well, in case people are interested in reading it. One of the few sources available in English. But so when he wrote his Confession of Faith, I find some very fascinating characteristics. One of them is that he never condemns any other group. So you read other confessions of faith, and they say, we condemn the Anabaptists, or we condemn the Lutherans, or we condemn the Calvinists, or we don't see it like them. And he never does that. In fact, the only group that he does condemn is the Roman Catholics, and he does that even more implicitly than explicitly. A lot of times he doesn't even name them. He just says, we condemn this view. And so formally, no Protestants are condemned in his confession of faith. But then secondly, he just doesn't mention a lot of the doctrines that were dividing Christians in the day. It's not in his confession of faith. He doesn't say that you have to have an Episcopalian or a Presbyterian form of government. He doesn't say that you can or can't have religious art. He talks about predestination in one line in the last chapter, in the last paragraph of the last chapter of his confession of faith. And then something that I find absolutely fascinating is that when he wrote his first draft, we actually found his first draft. It's up in England. We actually found it. And in his first draft, he did not even mention the recipients of baptism, whether it needed to be babies or not. It just wasn't even mentioned. Now, he got pushback from the other churches that had to approve his confession of faith. And so in the margin, he scribbled in like, the church has always baptized babies, so we're going to keep baptizing them. But it wasn't like this robust argument from Scripture, which really is different than the rest of his confession. He cites the Bible, incessantly, but there he doesn't even cite Scripture. And so a lot of the controversial issues, he just doesn't even talk about them. And then when he does talk about a controversial issue, for example, the Lord's Supper, the language that he uses is tight enough to exclude, for example, the extreme views of like transubstantiation, but it's loose enough so that let's call them a Calvinist or a Lutheran, they could both say, yeah, I can subscribe to this. And actually, for the rest of his life, he actually fought for the Concord of Wittenberg of 1536. I'm sure you're familiar with that. And he fought for that for the rest of his life. He said, we've got a uniting document on the Lord's Supper. In theory, there should be no more divide between Lutherans and Calvinists on this issue. And that was his issue on the Lord's Supper. And so, and I can just say one more thing. He was one of the few people, Orthodox Christians. I mean, he's clearly Orthodox, not heterodox in any way, but he was clearly a Orthodox thinker who was willing to read Anabaptist literature. And he said, what are they saying? And I haven't been able to do the study of showing the influence of Anabaptist thought on him, but he put such an emphasis on love and such an emphasis on incarnating the Christian faith that it would not surprise me at all if someone could draw parallels from the Anabaptist spirituality onto Reina and his confession of faith. So, he doesn't formally condemn other Protestants. He just remains silent on a lot of controversial issues. And when he does talk about a controversial issue, he has it tight enough so that it's orthodox, but it's loose enough to allow for people of different particular points to say, okay, I can subscribe to this. So the fact that the reason why I think he was more open than Anglicans is his view on baptism. I'm not saying that he was necessarily a cradle Baptist, although we know that Spanish Protestants were talking about cradle baptism in the 16th century. But I'm not saying that he was a cradle Baptist, but he does not seem to want to exclude cradle Baptists from the church. And so yeah, that's why I say it's like Anglicanism, but I think it was even a broader vision. He really did not want to exclude true Christians from the church. And I think he fought hard in expressing himself to do that. And I don't think it was just him. I'm talking a lot about this one figure, but he was an influential figure and very good friends with other influential Spanish reformers. And we actually find echoes of Reina's approach to theology in their writings as well. So I think he was just representative of Spanish Protestantism and this kind of broad vision that they had for the church.
Well, I want him to be my pastor. He sounds lovely. No, but I really do resonate with so much of this, and so I want to try to pivot a little bit to what we can learn from it today, because that's immediately where my mind goes. I think of how divided we are over different issues, especially in the YouTube space that I inhabit. There's so much polemics back and forth over really fine theological details, and I always try to balance the fact that doctrine matters, like theology matters. People have died for this stuff. It's important stuff, and we should care about it, with the fact of not missing the forest for the trees. And you talked about how persecution can have this wonderful side effect of being able to focus on what's really important and leaving behind what's not important. And I guess the way I want to connect that is to say, how do we kind of live that vision out today, especially in areas of the world where we don't have persecution forcing us to unite around those main things. It seems like when the church isn't persecuted, it has times to debate and to divide over everything. But even if someone's in a situation like that, and increasingly I think the situations are changing, but how do you think about living out that vision of the Spanish Reformation and what that looks like in our world? And maybe that looks different in your context as well. So I'd love to hear about that.
Well, how do we live it out today? I think that there are some good attempts to live it out today. For example, I come from a Baptist background. I now say that I'm Spanish Reformed because that's where I live, and I've started a church here in our town, and our confession of faith is Reina's confession of faith. So I say I'm Spanish Reformed, but I come from a Baptist context, and I, with another Baptist, Anthony Lane, we wrote with two Anglicans, Michael Bird, and I forget who the other one is. I'm sorry. A united statement on dual practice baptism, that baptism should not divide us. We can both justify our postures from Scripture. We can both justify it from early church history. We're following Christ. We're under His lordship. This should not divide us. And so I think I actually initiated this whole thing with these people, and that just came out of the Spanish Reformation's influence on my life. Why are we dividing over this issue? It should not be a primary issue. Now, I don't know if you're going to get the pushback or I'm going to get the pushback on the practical, how does this work on a local church level? I haven't gotten all this worked out. I don't know. Although I think I have an article published on infant dedication in the early church, which I think can go a long way in bridging the gap, but that's maybe for a different conversation. But I think that's a very good a way that we can learn from Spanish reformers and applying that today. What really is primary, what really is secondary. If we as Reformed Catholics have been fighting over this for 400 or 500 years, maybe we should just, for now at least, say, look, we can still hold our position strongly and firmly, but let's stop the condemnation. Let's stop saying, you're clearly ignoring scripture. You're clearly going against early church precedent. Let's stop with that rhetoric and let's say, look, maybe I don't agree with you, but I don't want to divide from you either. I don't want to separate from you either. And so I think that's an example of what we can do today. And then, the Lord's Supper. I it's it's interesting when you study a historical figure. Sometimes it's difficult to know where you end and the person begins because they have such an influence on your life. It's hard to separate yourself from them sometimes. But Reina's had such a big impact on my life that I've become a big proponent of the Wittenberg Concord, or the Concord of Wittenberg as well, uh, trying to unite the church on the key expression that there is a sacramental union between Christ and the bread and the wine. Sacramental, ultimately coming translation of the word mysterious, the Greek word mysterion. There is a mysterious union in Christ, between Christ and the elements. And so, maybe we could apply the Wittenberg Concord somehow, or look at it again to see if we can have unity in the church on that issue. So, those are a couple ways that come to mind as far as how we can apply that today.
I really like that. And I want to say here, you made a note about Reina being willing to read Anabaptists, which was really unique at his time. I think a lot of people might not appreciate just how strange that was. Um, Especially, we said, to be completely fair, like persecution wasn't a unique thing for Roman Catholics. Protestants did it. And one of the most lamentable things for me in the history of early Protestantism is the persecution that Anabaptists faced at the hands of Protestants. And I think that's something we should lament. And I wonder, what that might teach us, that Reina was willing to read these people. Certainly there's this balance of being wise and what we choose to consume theologically, right? But also being charitable and open. I don't know. Do you think there's something in that specifically of his openness to the Anabaptists that we can think about as well?
Yeah, and I'm not saying, and I don't think you're saying either, that we should accept everything that we read. We can read people and disagree with them, but the fact that these people were being persecuted by the Roman Catholic Church, that they were trying to focus on Christ, that they were trying to focus on living out the Christian faith, etc., 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 that made him say, I like to read them. What do they have to say? Is there something that we can learn from them? And so yeah, I guess that's my approach. Now I will say this: there is so much to read that I often don't have time to read modern day equivalent of Anabaptist, but I don't discourage it either. If someone can point us to Christ, if someone can edify us, then I don't see any reason why we shouldn't listen to them.
Yeah, and I think that last note's a good balance too, because I know I've gone through pendulum swings at different times of you get really excited about a certain like lane of theology. I remember getting obsessed with T.F. Torrance for a time. Like I just wanted to read Torrance all the time. And there's nothing wrong with that. Like I learned a lot from Torrance. But then at other times feeling like, oh man, there's so much wisdom throughout the Christian tradition, not just over time, but today. Like, man, maybe I should be reading Hauerwas and all of these other people and Moltmann or whatever, like even people that I might disagree on things. And I think, the note of like, there's just a lot to read and we can't put unrealistic expectations on ourselves is probably a helpful note for my audience as well. I'm
Yeah.
certainly a big fan of reading widely, learning from lots of different voices, but like you've only got so many hours in the day too. So I just appreciate that note from a practical standpoint there. I want to pivot a little bit. You mentioned that you're a pastor, church planter in Spain today. I know very little about what the church looks like in Spain right now. I would love to know, from your perspective, both what Protestantism and Catholicism look like there today, because I know you just wrote a Spanish language book on Catholic, Protestant kind of dividing points, right? It's like Catholic but not Roman, I think. is the title there. You've got it behind you on the shelf, so feel free
Yeah.
to plug that as well, and there'll be a link to it. There you go. Um, but yeah, I'd love to know what the Protestant church looks like and what the Catholic church looks like, especially because most of my audience are in the U.S. Or in the U.K. I think is the next biggest, but especially on the latter part of what Catholicism looks like, I think a lot of people have this picture of Catholicism that looks only like Bishop Barron or some of this like really theologically acute English speaking kind of Catholicism that looks very different than Latin American Catholicism and very different than European Catholicism. So, big question, but how would you describe the state of the church, both Catholic and Protestant, in Spain today?
So this is a bit of the sad part of the Spanish Reformation, and it's a part of what I think the Lord has put before me. There is essentially zero connection between what happened here in the 16th century and the Spanish Protestant Church today. That it was wiped off the face of the country. It was largely forgotten. There was a movement in the mid 19th century to try to recover some of their works, which had some limited success. But by and large, it was just illegal to be Protestant in Spain from the 16th century all the way up to the probably mid 19th century. And then after that, during periods of times, it was either illegal or very hard to be Protestant in Spain. And so when in the mid 19th century, English and Germans, they started sending missionaries to Spain, primarily from the Brethren background. The Brethren, I don't know if you know about them, but they really wanted to evangelize Roman Catholic countries. So they sent a lot of money and they sent a lot of people to Portugal and Spain and France and Italy. And that's just what they wanted to do. And so they were like the exact antithesis to Roman Catholics because the Brethren movement come out of the Anglican Church, and I mean they were just like anti-tradition, anti-liturgy, anti. I mean even church. They just wanted community groups. They didn't want a church. And so I mean just the exact antithesis. Personal Bible reading and I mean everything that Roman Catholicism was in Spain. They were like the exact opposite mirror image of that. And so and they were the major players in the game for 100 years, from the 1860s to the 1960s. And then since the 1960s, the major player in Spain has been the charismatic movement from Central and South America. And so, in Germany, there is a continuous tradition of Lutheran thought that then kind of gets filtered out even to all the other denominations. Same way with England and the Anglican Church, it just kind of gets filtered out. You can kind of trace from Methodism back to the Anglican Church, or from the English Baptist to the English Presbyterian to the Anglicans. It's Anglicanism just kind of had this leavening influence on all of the denominations and spinoffs that came from them. And in Spain, it's nothing like that. The Spanish Reformation, a traditional classic 16th 17th century Spanish Reformation, has really had no influence on Spain or the broader Spanish speaking world. And so part of my mission, what I want to do, what I think the Lord has put before me, is to relaunch the Spanish Reformation, not to like make a 16th century church in 21st century Spain, but to basically do ressourcement, to use the riches that we have, and to establish an authentic Spanish church in Spain. And so the Spanish church in Spain is very, very low church, very evangelical. And I don't use these terms derogatory, just really explaining what it's like. Many denominations, very few Lutherans here, very few Anglicans here, a few more Presbyterians, but by and large, Brethren, Charismatic, and Baptist are the major denominations in Spain. And then as far as the Roman Catholic Church is concerned, it's very interesting because I'm from America, and Roman Catholicism seems very Protestant to me in America. Here, it's very Roman Catholic. It's, in fact, it's a bit sad from my perspective entering into a lot of churches whether it's a big cathedral or just a small church of the local town, the predominant figure that in the center of the church is not Jesus, it's Mary. More often than not, it's Mary, and she's not only there, but she's all over the place. And Jesus will be somewhere, but he is not. In many churches, he is not the primary figure, and that just kind of represents how a lot of, at least people in southern Spain, how a lot of them understand Christianity. It's very heavily focused on Mary, and so um, you know, in addition to that, the Roman Catholic Church has lost a lot of its prestige since they became officially a lay country. It's no longer a country led by the Roman Catholic Church. It's officially a secular country, and so their influence is waning. Um, so yeah, it's very different. The Roman Catholic Church is very different here. Now, I will say this: I have a great relationship with Roman Catholics here, going to conferences together, and in fact, I'm now friends with the academic dean of the Roman Catholic Seminary in Seville. We just exchanged books with each other, and he just invited me to give a conference on the Trinity at his seminary. So, I mean, I have a good relationship with some of them. So, but it is I guess just say that the Roman Catholic Church in Spain is very different than any Roman Catholic Church I ever experienced in America.
That's helpful. And I hear that generally seems to be the case across the Spanish speaking world. And it's interesting, even just as an anecdote, in the kind of YouTube circles I run in, there seems to be now these kind of intramural Catholic debates going on in the English speaking world of like, have we over Protestantized the church? Like, do we need to reassert the importance of purgatory and the treasury of merits and kind of, more of not just doctrinally, but also like the traditional piety, people bringing back like the scapular and these things that really make a lot of Protestants squirm. But it seems like in the English speaking world, the gap between Catholicism and like Anglicanism seems kind of small at times. Whereas if you look at that gap then between like in Mexico or in other places, and it sounds like in Spain, not just doctrine, but especially like the personal piety is rather different, which is just intriguing to hear. Um, I think I'd like to touch on, we're almost at time here, but we mentioned your book, and you also mentioned that you see yourself as kind of, continuing the legacy of Reina and these other figures. So talk to me about some of the main things that you're addressing in this book. And it sounds like it's going to be coming kind of straight from your great love for these reformers and kind of carrying up their or picking up their torch.
Yeah. So just kind of an anecdote. I recently been listening to some of Gavin Ortland's works, and I just recently found his book, What It Means to Be a Protestant. It was very interesting to see. I'd never read his book. My book was published before I even saw his book, but they're very similar. It's very interesting. I told my wife this the other day after I'd kind of looked through his book a little bit. I said, I think I wrote like the Spanish version of What It Means to Be a Protestant without even realizing it. But so what my biggest concern, and I'm speaking from the Spanish speaking world, is that Spanish Protestants, their for many of them, their identity is I am not Roman Catholic. And I mean that is how they see themselves. In fact, I've spoken with Christians who say we don't pray the Lord's Prayer because Roman Catholics pray the Lord's Prayer. And I just think, holy cow, man, like, this is not the right way to go about doing things. And so I don't want Reformed Catholics, Protestants in the Spanish speaking world, I don't want their identity to be, we are not Roman Catholics. I want their identity to be, this is what Scripture says, this is what the tradition says, and we're continuing in that. And so I divided up my book into three parts. One shows all that we have in common with Roman Catholics. And I think a lot of people in the Spanish speaking world don't realize just how much we have in common with them. I mean, we have so much in common with them. And in fact, when I think of what happened in the 16th century, if we kind of take the Nicene Creed as a guide to doctrine, we never wanted to reform the doctrine of God the Father as creator. neither the person of the Father, neither his work of creation. We never wanted to reform the person or the work of the Son, who he is or his work of redemption. Now, that's where the line of Mary comes in. So, we'd probably have to talk about that part of the creed. But by and large, we never wanted to touch that. We never wanted to touch the doctrine of the person of the Spirit. I mean, we are Trinitarian, the same as they are. He's God and all that. The Protestant Reformation was a reformation primarily of the work of the Spirit and the church and salvation. So those final articles on what it means to be the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church and what it means to confess one baptism for the forgiveness of sins, those are ecclesial doctrines. And we didn't want to protest the whole thing in those doctrines, just certain points of those. And so, I see the Reformation as primarily concerned with the work of the Spirit in the church and in salvation. And so, the second part of the book is what distinguishes us from Roman Catholics. So, first part of the book, based on Scripture and tradition, this is what we have in common with Roman Catholics. Second part of the book, based on Scripture and tradition, this is what we don't have in common with Roman Catholics. And I think we can make a great case based on Scripture and tradition on issues like the canon or the presence of Christ in Lord's Supper or justification, Mary. I think we can make a good case. Look, this is why we believe what we believe. And then the third part of the book is self-critical in the sense that I try to forcefully put my finger on a problem in Protestantism, which is our lack of unity, or I should say our lack of visible unity. And I know that hurts to put your finger in a wound, but I do that not to cause pain, but to draw our attention to there is a problem here. This hurts, right? When I push here, well, that means there's a problem there. And so the third part of the book is to put my finger there and say, guys, we have to address this issue. We've grown way too comfortable with saying, well, I'm Baptist, you're Presbyterian, so we go to different churches, and even saying, you're not allowed to take the Lord's Supper in my church. I mean, we were just going way too comfortable with things like this. And so after that, I make a call to have greater visible unity. And in the Spanish-speaking context, because it's so different, it's really a call to go back to historic Protestantism, to return to our historic confessions of faith, but with the important difference that we're not returning back to them and then building walls up and saying, okay, well, I've now accepted, the Augsburg Confession, and if you don't confess the Augsburg Confession, I don't want anything to do with you. But rather, going back to the 16th and 17th centuries and then trying to draw bridges and make connections with others, and to be gracious about it and to say, look, this is my confession, and we don't see everything eye to eye, but we see 98% eye to eye, and you're a brother, I'm a brother, you're welcome at my church, I'm welcome at yours, let's celebrate Lord's Supper, you're a true church, we're a true church, and just to take a first step towards greater visible unity. So that's kind of the argument of the book.
Well, that sounds absolutely wonderful, and I'll be sure to link that in the description down below as well, because I do think there's a need for good Spanish language resources on these types of topics as well. I know that's been a topic of conversation that I've had with various people involved in this space, so I'm glad that you're doing that work. Dr. Messmer, this has been absolutely fantastic. I really appreciate your time in this today. We've mentioned a couple of things that you've worked on, your book, the translation of Reina's Confession. I want to allow you a second. I know you said at the very beginning of this that you couldn't fill a full bookshelf with resources from the Spanish Reformation, and it sounds like if you were to put those into English, I don't even know if you could fill a full shelf. But if someone comes away from this and they say, like, wow, this is really interesting, like, I want to know more about this, whether that's the history or the specific figures, is there anything that you can recommend, bonus points if it's in English, but if there's something that, you say that's in Spanish that, if someone is capable of reading that, definitely should check out as well?
Yeah, great question. I would say probably the best place to start is Reina's Confession of Faith. You can get that online. It's like $4 or $5 on Amazon. Very, very accessible. Um, Unfortunately, a lot of the really good stuff still is not translated into English. Now, I am working slowly with someone to translate this into English and to have something like, a reader in the Spanish Reformation, but it's a slow work. 16th century Spanish and trying to make it understandable, and it's slow. But so I mean, it's in the works, but it's probably still a few years away from being published. But I would say, I will say this: one of Europe's most famous preachers was a Spanish reformer. His name was, I'm saying in English, how do you say that? Constantino de la Fuente. Constantino de la Fuente is how you would say in Spanish, but it's hard to say sometimes with that accent. And anything you can read by him, by Constantino de la Fuente, is beautiful prose and deep, rich, primarily Augustinian theology. And when you can wed truth with that aesthetic beauty of the spoken word, it's absolutely beautiful. So I would encourage people to go to him. He's a rich personal piety, knowledgeable man. He would be a good one to go to. Well, there's a work that I'd like to mention, but we just have the draft. It's not ready yet, but I'll just mention it. But there was the first person to translate the New Testament. His name was Francisco de Encinas, and he translated into Spanish one of Luther's works and one of Calvin's works in the same work. Another gesture towards this kind of ecumenical vision. And he wrote a prologue to Calvin's work, and in it he says the key to the Christian life is our union with Christ. And it's just this amazing exposition. An English translation is probably 15 or 20 pages of looking at union with Christ from different perspectives and bringing us back time and time again. We are united to him as a husband to a wife by faith in the Holy Spirit. Just beautiful work. So if anyone can get that in Spanish, I would encourage them to read that, or Lord willing, wait just a few more years and then we'll have it for you in English. So those are some of the works that come to mind. I mean, there are many works that come to mind, but unfortunately they're just not available in English. So yeah, I will say this: if anyone is listening to this and is bilingual, please get in touch with me and you can help us translate some of these works into English.
Well, there you go. It sounds like you are doing good work, and always good to have other people join you in that. So I hope that people take that up. But Dr. Messmer, thank you so much for this. This was an absolute pleasure.
Thank you very much. It was a joy.